to his bedroom. The Queer Story of Brownlow's Newspaper by H.G. Wells. I call this a queer story because it is a story without an explanation. When I first heard it, in scraps from Brownlow, I found it queer and incredible. But it refuses to remain incredible. After resisting and then questioning and scrutinizing and falling back before the evidence, after rejecting all his evidence as an elaborate mystification and refusing to hear any more about it, and then being drawn to reconsider it by an irresistible curiosity, and so going through it all again, I have been forced to the conclusion that Brownlow, so far as he can tell the truth, has been telling the truth. But it remains queer truth, queer and exciting to the imagination. The more credible his story becomes, the queerer it is. It troubles my mind. I am fevered by it, infected not with germs, but with notes of interrogation and unsatisfied curiosity. Brownlow is, I admit, a cheerful spirit. I have known him to tell lies, but I have never known him to do anything so elaborate and sustained as this affair, if it is a mystification, would have to be. He is incapable of anything so elaborate and sustained. He is too lazy and easy-going for anything of the sort. And he would have laughed. At some stage he would have laughed and given the whole thing away. He has nothing to gain by keeping it up. His honour is not in the case either way. And after all, there is his bit of newspaper in evidence, and the scrap of an addressed wrapper. I realise it will damage this story for many readers that it opens with Brownlow in a state very definitely on the gayer side of sobriety. He was not in a mood for cool and calculated observation, much less for accurate record. He was seeing things in an exhilarated manner. He was disposed to see them and greet them cheerfully and let them slip by out of attention. The limitations of time and space lay lightly upon him. It was after midnight. He had been dining with friends. I have inquired what friends, and satisfied myself upon one or two obvious possibilities of that dinner party. They were, he said to me, just friends. They hadn't anything to do with it. I don't usually push past an assurance of this sort, but I made an exception in this case. I watched my man and took a chance of repeating the question. There was nothing out of the ordinary about that dinner party, unless it was the fact that it was an unusually good dinner party. The host was Redpath Baines, the solicitor, and the dinner was in his house in St. John's Wood. Gifford of the Evening Telegraph, whom I knew slightly, was, I found, present, and from him I got all I wanted to know. There was much bright and discursive talk, and Brownlow had been inspired to give an imitation of his aunt, Lady Clitherholm, reproving an inconsiderate plumber during some rebuilding operations at Clitherholm. This early memory had been received with considerable merriment. He was always very good about his aunt Clitherholm, and Brownlow had departed obviously elated by this little social success and the general geniality of the occasion. Had they talked, I asked, about the future, or Einstein, or J.W. Dunn, or any such high and serious topic at that party? They had not. Had they discussed the modern newspaper? No. There had been nobody whom one could call a practical joker at this party, and Brownlow had gone off alone in a taxi. That is what I was most desirous of knowing. He had been duly delivered by his taxi at the main entrance to Sussex Court. Nothing untoward is to be recorded of his journey in the lift to the 5th floor of Sussex Court. The liftman on duty noted nothing exceptional. I asked if Brownlow said good night. The liftman does not remember. Usually he says night-o, reflected the liftman. manifestly doing his best and with nothing particular to recall. And there the fruits of my inquiries about the condition of Brownlow on this particular evening conclude. The rest of the story comes directly from him. He went down the long passage, with its red carpet, its clear light, and its occasional oaken doors, each with its artistic brass number. I have been down that passage with him on several occasions. It was his custom to enliven that corridor by raising his hat gravely as he passed each entrance, saluting his unknown and invisible neighbours, addressing them softly but distinctly by playful, if sometimes slightly indecorous names of his own devising, expressing good wishes or paying them little compliments. He came at last to his own door, number 49, and let himself in without serious difficulty. He switched on his hall light. Scattered on the polished oak floor and invading his Chinese carpet were a number of letters and circulars, the evening's mail. His parlour-maid housekeeper, who slept in a room in another part of the building, had been taking her evening out, and these letters would have been gathered up and put on the desk in his bureau. As it was, they lay on the floor. He closed his door behind him, or it closed of its own accord. He took off his coat and wrap, placed his hat on the head of the Greek charioteer whose bust adorns his hall, and set himself to pick up his letters. He was a little annoyed to miss the Evening Standard. It is his custom, he says, to subscribe for the afternoon edition of The Star to read at tea time, and also for the final edition of the Evening Standard to turn over the last thing at night, if only on account of Lowe's cartoon. He gathered up all these envelopes and packets and took them with him into his little sitting room. There he turned on the electric heater. He went to his bedroom to put on soft slippers and replace his smoking jacket by a frog jacket of llama wool, returned to his sitting room and sat down in the armchair by the reading lamp to examine his correspondence. All these details were routines he had repeated scores of times. Brownlow's is not a preoccupied mind. It goes out to things. He is one of those buoyant extroverts who open and read all their letters and circulars whenever they can get hold of them. In the daytime his secretary intercepts and deals with most of them, but at night he escapes from her control and does what he pleases. Well, that is to say, he opens everything. He ripped up various envelopes. There was a formal acknowledgment of a business letter he had dictated the day before. Then there was a letter from his solicitor asking for some details about a settlement he was making. There was an offer from some unknown gentleman with an aristocratic name to lend him money on his note of land alone. And there was a notice about a proposed new wing to his club. Same old stuff, he sighed. Same old stuff. What bores they all are. He was always hoping, like every man who's proceeding across the plains of middle age, that these correspondences would contain agreeable surprises, and it never did. Then he picked up the remarkable newspaper. It was different in appearance from an ordinary newspaper, but not so different as not to be recognizable as a newspaper, and he was surprised, he says, not to have observed it before. It was enclosed in a wrapper of pale green, but it was unstamped. Apparently it had been delivered not by the postman, but by some other hand. This wrapper still exists. I have seen it. He had already torn it off before he noted that he was not the addressee. For a moment or so he remained looking at this address, which struck him as just a little odd. It was printed in rather unusual type. Evan O'Hara, Mr. Sussex Court, 49. Wrong name, said Mr. Brownlow. Right address. Rummy, Sussex Court, 49. Suppose he got my Evening Standard. Change, no robbery. He put the torn wrapper with his unanswered letters and opened out the newspaper. The title of the paper was printed in large, slightly ornamental black-green letters that might have come from a kindred font to that responsible for the address, but as he read it, it was the Evening Standard, or at least it was the Even Standard. "Silly," said Brownlow. "It's some damn Irish paper. Can't spell anything, these Irish." He had, I think, a passing idea, suggested perhaps by the green wrapper and the green ink, that it was some lottery stunt from Dublin. Still, if there was anything to read, he meant to read it. He surveyed the front page. Across this ran a steamer headline. "Wilton Boring reaches 7 miles. Success assured." "No," said Brownlow, "it must be oil. A literate lot, these old chaps. Leave out the S in success." He leaned back into his chair to take a dispassionate view of any oil share pushing that might be afoot. But it wasn't an affair of oil. It was, he began to dawn upon him, something stranger than oil. He found himself surveying a real evening newspaper, which was dealing, so far as he could see at the first onset, with the affairs of another world. He had for a moment a feeling as though he and his armchair and his little sitting room were afloat in vast space, and then it all seemed to become firm and solid again. The thing in his hands was plainly and indisputably a printed newspaper. It was a little odd in its letterpress, and it didn't feel or rustle like ordinary paper, but newspaper it was. It was printed in either 3 or 4 columns. For the life of him, he cannot remember which, and there were column headlines under the page streamer. It had a sort of Art Nouveau affair at the bottom of one column that might be an advertisement. It showed a woman in an impossibly big hat, and in the upper left corner was an unmistakable weather chart of Western Europe, with coloured isobars or isotherms or whatever they are, and the inscription, "Tomorrow's weather." And then he remarked the date. The date was November 10th, 1971. "Steady on," said Brownlow, "steady on." He held the paper sideways, and then straight again. The date remained, November 10th, 1971. He got up in a state of immense perplexity, and he put the paper down. For a moment he felt a little afraid of it. He rubbed his forehead. "Haven't been doing a Rip Van Winkle by any chance, Brownlow, my boy?" he said. He picked up the paper again, walked out into his hall, and looked at himself in the hall mirror. He was reassured to see no signs of advancing age, but the expression of mingled consternation and amazement upon his flushed face struck him suddenly as being undignified and unwarrantable. He laughed at himself, but not uncontrollably. On the console table there was a little respectable-looking adjustable calendar bearing witness that the date was November 10th, 1931. "Do you see?" he said, shaking the queer newspaper at it reproachfully. "I ought to have spotted you for a hoax 10 minutes ago. Moosing trick, to say the least of it. I suppose they've made Lowe editor for a night, and he's had this idea, huh?" He felt he had been taken in, but that the joke was a good one. And with quite unusual anticipations of entertainment, he returned to his armchair. A good idea it was, a paper 40 years ahead. Good fun if it was well done. For a time, nothing but the sounds of a newspaper being turned over and Brownlow's breathing could have broken the silence of the flat. Regarded as an imaginative creation, he found the thing almost too well done. Every time he turned a page, he expected the sheep to break out into laughter and to give the whole thing away. But it did nothing of the kind. From being a mere quip, an immense and amusing, if perhaps a little over-elaborate, lark. and then, as a lark, it passed from stage to stage of incredibility, until, as anything but the thing it professed to be, it was incredible altogether. It must have cost far more than an ordinary number. All sorts of colours were used, and suddenly he came upon illustrations that went beyond amazement. They were in the colours of reality. Never in all his life had he seen such colour printing, and the buildings and the scenery and the costumes in the pictures were strange and yet credible. They were colour photographs of actuality 40 years from now. He could not believe anything else of them. Doubt could not exist in their presence. His mind had swung back away from the stunt number idea altogether. The paper in his hand would not simply be costly beyond dreaming to produce. At any price, it could not be produced. All this present world could not produce such an object as this paper he held in his hand. He was quite capable of realizing that. He sat turning the sheet over. His skeptical faculties were largely in suspense. The barriers of criticism were down. His mind could now accept the idea that he was reading a newspaper of 40 years ahead without further protest of any kind. It had been addressed to Mr. Evan O'Hara, and it had come to him. Well and good. This Evan O'Hara evidently knew how to get ahead of things. I doubt if at the time Brownlow found anything very wonderful in the situation, yet it was, and continues to be, a very wonderful situation. Only gradually have I been able to build up this picture of Brownlow turning over that miraculous sheet, so that I can believe it myself, and you will understand how I asked him, to satisfy a devouring curiosity, what was there in it? What did it have to say? What was there in it? In other words, what will the world be doing 40 years from now? That was the stupendous scale of the vision, of which Brownlow was afforded a glimpse. The world, 40 years from now. I lie awake at nights, thinking of all that paper might have revealed to us. Much it did reveal, but there is hardly a thing it reveals that does not change at once into a constellation of riddles. When first he told me about the thing, I was intensely skeptical. I asked him questions in what people call a nasty manner. I was dreaming, I suppose, he said. I'm beginning to doubt it all myself. But then it occurred to me that if he was not allowed to tell and put on record what he had seen, he might become confused about it himself. So we arranged to go down to Surrey for the weekend. There we set ourselves in earnest. First of all, to recover anything he could remember about his newspaper, and then to form some coherent idea of the world about which it was telling. The streamer headline across the page about that 7-mile Wilton boring is, to my mind, one of the most significant items in the story. About that we are fairly clear. It referred, says Brownlow, to a series of attempts to tap the supply of heat beneath the surface of the earth. I asked various questions. It was explained, you know, said Brownlow, and smiled and held out a hand with twiddling fingers. It was explained all right. Old system, they said, was to go down from a few 100 feet to a mile or so, and bring up coal, and burn it, and then go down a bit deeper, and there's no need to bring up and burn anything. Just get the heat itself straight away. Comes up of its own accord, under its own steam. See? Simple. They were making a big fuss about it, he added. It wasn't only the streamer headline, there was a leading article in big type. Where was it headed? Ah, "The age of combustion has ended." Now that is plainly a very big event for mankind, caught in mid-happening, November 10th, 1971, and the way in which Brownlow describes it as being handled shows clearly a world much more preoccupied by economic essentials than the world of today, and dealing with them on a larger scale and in a bolder spirit. That excitement about tapping the central reservoirs of heat, Brownlow was very definite, was not the only symptom of an increase in practical economic interest and intelligence. There was much more space given to scientific work and to inventions than is down in any contemporary paper. There were diagrams and mathematical symbols, he says, but he did not look into them very closely because he could not get the hang of them. Frightfully highbrow, some of it, he said. A more intelligent world for our grandchildren, evidently, and also, as the pictures testified, a healthier and happier world. The fashions kept you looking, said Brownlow, going off at a tangent, all coloured up as they were. Were they elaborate? I asked. Anything but, he said. His descriptions of these costumes is vague. The people depicted in the social illustrations and in the advertisements seems to have reduced bodily clothing. I mean things like vests, pants, socks, and so forth, to a minimum. Breast and chest went bare. There seems to have been tremendously exaggerated wristlets, mostly on the left arm, and going as far up as the elbow, provided with gadgets which served the purpose of pockets. Most of these armlets seem to have been very decorative, almost like little shields. And then, usually, there was an immense hat, often rolled up and carried in the hand, and long cloaks of the loveliest colours, and evidently also of the most beautiful soft material, which either trailed from a sort of gorget, or were gathered up and wrapped around the body, or were belted up, or thrown over the shoulders. There were a number of pictures of crowds from various parts of the world. The people looked fine, said Brownlow. Prosperous, and upstanding, some of the women just lovely. My mind went off to India. What was happening in India? Brownlow could not remember anything very much about India. I found the politicians stirring in me. Was there really nothing about India? Was he sure of that? There was certainly nothing that had left any impression in Brownlow's mind. And Soviet Russia? Not as Soviet Russia, said Brownlow. All that trouble had ceased to be a matter of daily interest. And how was France getting on with Germany? Brownlow could not recall a mention of either of these two great powers, nor of the British Empire as such, nor of the USA. There was no mention of any interchanges, communications, ambassadors, any conferences, competitions, comparisons, stresses in which these governments figured so far as he could remember. He racked his brains. I thought perhaps all that had been going on, so entirely like it goes on today, and has been going on for the last 100 years, that he had run his eyes over the passages in question, and that they had left no distinctive impression on his mind. But he is positive it was not like that. Well, all that stuff was washed out, he said. He is unshaken in his assertion that there were no elections in progress, no notice of Parliament or politicians, no mention of Geneva or anything about armaments or war. All those main interests of a contemporary journal seem to have been among the washed-out stuff. It isn't that Brownlow didn't notice them very much. He's just positive they were not there. Now, to me, this is a very wonderful thing indeed. It means, I take it, that in only 40 years from now, the great game of sovereign states will be over. It looks also as if the parliamentary game will be over, and if some new method of handling human affairs will have been adopted. Not a word of patriotism or nationalism, not a word of party, nor of a nation. But in only 40 years. Well, half the human beings already alive in the world will still be living. You cannot believe that for a moment. Nor could I, if it wasn't for two little torn scraps of paper. These, as I will make clear, leave me in a state of, well, how can I put it? Incredulous belief. It was not only that there was this absence of national politics from that evening paper, but there was something else, still more fundamental. Business, we both think, finance, that is, was not in evidence, at least upon anything like contemporary lines. We're not quite sure of that, but that is our impression. There was no list of stock exchange prices, for example, no city page and nothing in its place. That also, it seems, will be washed out 40 years from now. Is there some tremendous revolutionary smash-up ahead, then, which will put an end to investment and speculation? Is the world going Bolshevik? In the paper, anyhow, there was no sign of or reference to anything of that kind. Yet against this idea of some stupendous economic revolution, we have the fact that here, 40 years ahead, is a familiar London evening paper still tumbling into a private individual's letterbox in the most uninterrupted manner. Not much suggestion of a social smash-up there. Much stronger is the effect of immense changes which have come about bit by bit, day by day, hour by hour, without any sort of revolutionary jolt as morning or springtime comes to the world. The reader must forgive me them. Let me return to the story. There had been a picture of a landslide near Ventimiglia, and one of some new chemical works at Salzburg, and there had been a picture of fighting going on near Irkutsk. Of that picture, I will tell presently, a fading scrap survives. Now that was called, Brownlow made an effort and snapped his fingers triumphantly, Roundup of Brigands by Federal Police. What federal police? I asked. Well, there you have me, said Brownlow. The fellows on both sides looked mostly Chinese, but there were one or two taller fellows who might have been Americans or British or Scandinavian. What filled a lot of the paper, said Brownlow suddenly, was guerrillas. There was no end of a fuss about guerrillas, not so much about that boring, but still a lot of fuss. Photographs, a map, a special article, and some paragraphs. The paper had, in fact, announced the death of the last guerrilla. Considerable resentment was displayed at the tragedy that had happened in the African Guerrilla Reserve. The guerrilla population of the world had been dwindling for many years. In 1931, it had been estimated at 900. When the Federal Board took it over, it had shrunken to 300. What Federal Board? I asked. Brownlow knew no more than I did. When he read the phrase, it had seemed all right somehow. Apparently this board had had too much to do all at once and insufficient resources. I had the impression at first that it must be some sort of conservation board, improvised under panic conditions to save the rare creatures of the world threatened with extinction. The gorillas had not been sufficiently observed and guarded, and they had been swept out of existence suddenly by a new and malignant form of influenza. The thing had happened, practically, before it was remarked. The paper was clamouring for inquiry and drastic changes of reorganisation. This Federal Board whatever it might be, seemed to be something of very considerable importance in the year 1971. Its name turned up again in an article of afforestation. This interested Brownlow considerably, because he has large holdings in lumber companies. This federal board was apparently not only responsible for the maladies of wild gorillas, but also for the plantation of trees in, just note these names, Canada, New York State, Siberia, Algiers, the east coast of England. And it was arranged for various negligencies in combating insect pests and various fungoid plant diseases. It jumped all our contemporary boundaries in the most astounding way. Its range was worldwide. In spite of the recent additional restrictions put upon the use of big timber in building and furnishing, there is a plain possibility of a shortage of shelter timber and of rainfall in nearly all the threatened regions from 1985 onwards. Admittedly, the federal board has come late to its task. From the beginning, its work has been urgency work, but in view of the lucid report prepared by the James Commission, there is little or no excuse for the inaggressiveness and overconfidence it has displayed. Now, I am able to quote that particular article because, as a matter of fact, it lies before me as I write. It is indeed, as I will explain, all that remains of this remarkable newspaper. The rest has been destroyed, and all that we can ever know of it now is through Brownlow's sound, but not absolutely trustworthy memory. My mind, as the days pass, hangs on to that federal board. Does that phrase mean, as just possibly it may mean, a world federation, a scientific control of all human life only 40 years from now? I find that idea of a world would unify, parliament of mankind and confederation of the world, as Tennyson puts it. But I have always supposed that the process would take centuries. Let me tell very briefly of the rest of that evening paper. There seemed to be a lot of sport and fashion, much about something called spectacle, with pictures, a lot of illustrated criticism of decorative art and of architecture. The architecture in the pictures he saw was towering, kind of magnificent, great blocks of building, like New York, but more so, and all run together. Unfortunately, I cannot sketch. There were sections devoted to something he couldn't understand, but which he thinks were radio program stuff. All that suggests a sort of advanced human life, very much like the life we lead today, but possibly rather brighter and better. But here is something different. The birth rate, said Brownlow, searching his mind, was 7 in the 1,000. I exclaimed. The lowest birth rates in Europe now are 16 or more per 1,000. The Russian birth rate is 40 per 1,000 and falling slowly. It was 7, said Brownlow. Exactly 7. I noticed it in a paragraph. But what birth rate? I asked. The British, the Europeans? It said the birth rate, said Brownlow. Just that. That, I think, is the most tantalizing item in all this strange glimpse of the world of our grandchildren. A birth rate of 7 in the 1,000 does not mean a fixed world population. It means a population that has been reduced at a very rapid rate, unless the death rate has gone still lower. Quite possibly. People will not be dying so much then, but living very much longer. On that, Brownlow could throw no light. The people in the pictures did not look to him an old lot. There were plenty of children and young or younger-looking people about. But Brownlow, I said, wasn't there any crime? Rather, said Brownlow. They had a big poisoning case on, but it was jolly hard to follow. You know how it is with these crimes. Unless you've read about it from the beginning, it's very hard to get a hang of the situation. There were several crimes, or what newspaper men call stories, personal stories. What struck me most about it was that they seemed to be more sympathetic than our reporters, more concerned with the motives, and less with just finding someone out. What you might call psychological, so to speak. Was there anything about books? I asked him. I didn't remember anything about books, he said. And that is all, except for a few trifling details, such as a possible 13th month inserted in the year. That is all. It is intolerably tantalizing. That is the substance of Brownlow's account of his newspaper. He read it as one might read any newspaper. He knew he was reading an evening newspaper of 40 years ahead, and he sat in front of his fire and was no more perturbed than he would have been if he had been reading an imaginative book about the future. Suddenly, his little clock pinged 2. He got up and yawned. He put that astounding, that miraculous newspaper down, as he was wont to put any old newspaper down. He carried off his correspondence to the desk in his bureau, and with the swift laziness of a very tired man, he dropped his clothes about his room anyhow and went to bed. But somehow in the night he woke up feeling thirsty and grey-minded. He lay awake, and it came to him that something very strange had occurred to him. His mind went back to the idea that he had been taken in by a very ingenious fabrication. He got up for a drink of water and a liver tablet. He put his head in cold water and found himself sitting on his bed, toweling his hair, and doubting whether he had really seen these photographs in those very colours of reality itself, or whether he had imagined them. Also running through his mind was the thought that the approach of a world timber famine for 1985 was something likely to affect his investments, and particularly a trust he was setting up on behalf of an infant in whom he was interested. It might be wise, he thought, to put more into timber. He went back down to the corridor to his sitting room. He sat there in his dressing gown, turning over the marvellous sheets. He went back to the timber paragraph. He felt he must keep that. I don't know if you will understand how his mind worked. For my own part, I can see at once how perfectly irrational and entirely natural it was. But he took this marvellous paper, creased the page in question, tore off this particular article, and left the rest. He returned very drowsily to his bedroom. He put the scrap of paper on his dressing table, got into bed, and dropped off to sleep at once. When he awoke, it was 9 o'clock. His parlour-maid, housekeeper, had just re-entered the room. "You were sleeping so peacefully," she said. "I couldn't bear to wake you. Shall I get you a fresh cup of tea?" Brownlow did not answer. He was trying to think of something strange that had happened. She repeated the question. "No. I'll come and have breakfast in my dressing gown before my bath," he said, and she went out of the room. Then he saw the scrap of paper. In a moment he was running down the corridor. I left a newspaper," he said. I left a newspaper." She came in response to the commotion he made. "Oh, a newspaper," she said. "It's been gone this 2 hours, down the chute with the dust and things." Brownlow had a moment of extreme consternation. "I wanted it kept," he said. "I wanted it kept." "But how was I to know you wanted it kept?" "I must "Get that newspaper back," said Brownlow. "It's vitally important. If all's to be held up, I want that newspaper back." "Oh, I've never known a thing come up that shoot again," said his housekeeper. "That's once gone down it, but I'll telephone down, sir, and see what can be done. Most of that stuff goes right into the hot water furnace, they say." And it does. The newspaper had gone. A raving, last effort of self-control, he consumed his cooling breakfast. In the midst of it, he got up a paper from his bedroom, a wrapper addressed to Mr. Evan, and the overnight letters on his bureau. That seemed most mad. This thing had. After he had breakfasted, he rang me up to aid. I found a paper before him. He made a solemn. "What's standing before? Tell me," he said. "What are these?" "It's either." He left unfinished. I picked up the torn wrapper and felt its texture. "Mr. It's called 14. I agreed and stared at him. "That's not hallucination, eh?" I shook my head. "And now this?" His hand trembled as he held out the cutting. I took it. "It was odd," I said as I stared at the black-green ink, the unfamiliar type, the little novelties in spelling. Then I turned the thing over. On the back of it was a piece of one of the illustrations. It was, I suppose, about a quarter of the photograph of that roundup of brigands by federal police I've already mentioned. When I saw it that morning, it had not even begun to fade. It represented a mass of broken masonry in a sandy waste, with bare-looking mountains in the distance. The cold, clear atmosphere, the glare of a cloudless afternoon, was rendered perfectly. In the foreground were 4 masked men in brown service uniforms, intent on working some little machine on wheels, with a tube and a nozzle that went out to the left, where the fragment was torn off. I cannot imagine what the jet was doing. Brownlow says he thinks they were gassing some men in a hut. Never have I seen such realistic colour printing. "What on earth is this?" I asked. "It's that," said Brownlow. "I'm not mad, am I? It's really that." "And what the devil is it?" "It's a piece of newspaper for November 10th, 1971. "You had better explain," I said, and sat down with the scrap of paper in my hand to hear his story, and with as much elimination of questions and digressions and repetitions as possible. That is the story I have written here. If it were not for the 2 little bits of paper, one might dispose of it quite easily. One might say that Brownlow had had a vision, a dream of unparalleled vividness and consistency, or that he had been hoaxed and his head turned by some elaborate mystification. Or again, one might suppose he had really seen into the future, with a sort of exaggeration of those provisions cited by Mr. J.W. Dunn in his remarkable Experiment with Time. But nothing Mr. Dunn has to advance can account for an actual evening paper being slapped through a letter slit 40 years in advance of the date. The wrapper has not altered in the least since first I saw it, but the scrap of paper with the article about afforestation is dissolving into a fine powder, and the fragment of picture at the back of it is fading out. Most of the colour is gone, and the outlines have lost their sharpness. Some of the powder I have taken to my friend Ryder at the Royal College, whose work in microchemistry is so well known. He says the stuff is not paper at all. Properly speaking, it is mostly aluminium, fortified by admixture with some artificial resinous substance. Though I offer no explanation whatever of this affair, I think I will venture on one little prophecy. I have an obstinate persuasion that on November 10th, 1971, the name of the tenant of 49 Sussex Court will be Mr. Evan O'Hara. There is no tenant of that name now in Sussex Court, and I find no evidence in the telephone directory or the London directory that such a person exists anywhere in London. And on that particular evening, 40 years ahead, he will not get his usual copy of the Evening Standard. Instead, he will get a copy of the Evening Standard of 1931. I have an incurable fancy that this will be so. There I may be right or wrong, but that Brownlow really got, and for 2 remarkable hours read, a real newspaper 40 years ahead of time. I am as convinced as I am convinced that my own name is Hubert G. Wells. Can I say anything stronger than that? The end.